So hello again, everyone, both online and here in the room with us today. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce our last but certainly not least panel of the day on managing truth in a post-truth world. So we chose the focus of this panel actually from a conversation with our industry advisory board of TIGA. And as part of that, we were talking about the challenges that misinformation and disinformation pose to us as our society, but also to our institutions and organisations. Misinformation and disinformation, as we've seen in contexts as diverse as vaccinations, elections and climate change, can sow the seed of doubt, breed unwarranted distrust, it can destroy reputations and livelihoods, and it can exacerbate ideological divisions and conflict and ultimately hinder our ability to be able to solve some of the greatest challenges that we face as a society. We have a stellar panel with us today to share their insights with us around how we can deal with the challenges of misinformation and how leaders and organisations can navigate and manage the digital landscape in a way that engenders trust and ethical conduct. So our panel today is truly interdisciplinary. Collectively, we bring together a perspective from journalism, the law, PR, and computer science. And unfortunately, we did have panellist Professor Matt Hornsey, but unfortunately, he's at home with COVID today, just tested positive this morning. So we're sorry that we won't be able to have the psychological perspective that Matt would have brought to the panel today. So our first panel member perhaps doesn't need any introduction, Peter Greste. Peter Greste is a journalist, author, media freedom activist and academic, and a founding member of the Alliance for Journalist Freedom. Peter was a UNESCO Chair in Journalism at the University of Queensland until recently and is now Professor of Journalism at Macquarie University. But before becoming an academic in 2018, he spent 25 years as a foreign correspondent working with the BBC, Reuters, Al Jazeera, CNN, amongst others, predominantly covering the Middle East, Latin America and Africa. Some of you may remember that back in 2013, Peter was arrested on terrorism charges while working on an assignment in Egypt. And after a trial that was widely dismissed as a sham, he was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in prison. After 400 days in prison behind bars, he was deported under presidential decree. Now, as a result of the letters that Peter wrote while in prison in the defence of freedom of the press, he won multiple awards, including the Walkley Award here in Australia, the British Royal Television Society Award, and in 2015, Peter was awarded the Australian Human Rights Medal for his advocacy for free speech and free media. Peter also wrote and directed the Four Corners documentary, Facebook, Cracking the Code, which is of particular perhaps relevance today. And we're so pleased that you could join us today, Peter. Really delighted to have you here, and I know for a fact that you've got many fans both in the audience, online and in the room. Sarah Holland is our second panellist. Sarah is a barrister in private practice at the Queensland Bar and holds a number of academic roles, including teaching media law at the University of Queensland. She's been teaching that for some time now. Sarah's practice covers a broad cross-section of civil and commercial litigation with a particular specialty in defamation. And she has appeared as a counsel in the High Court of Australia, the Queensland Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court, amongst others. Thank you so much again, Sarah, for joining us today and bringing that legal perspective. Donna Kramer is co-founder of Aruga, an award-winning PR company with a focus on reputation and brand management, media training and crisis communications. For 20 years, Donna has delivered communication solutions and business counsel for industry leaders across the cultural, tourism, lifestyle, property and non-profit sectors. She's one of Australia's most sought-after communications professionals. And Donna includes in her project highlights the G20 Global Summit Cultural Celebrations, Tourism and Events Queensland and the Brisbane Festival, amongst others. So welcome, Donna. And last but certainly not least, Gianluca Demartini. Gianluca is an Associate Professor in Data Science with us at University of Queensland. A focus of his research is understanding how people interact with misinformation on social media and how AI can be used to mitigate its spread online. His research has been funded by the Australian Research Council as well as Facebook and Google. and he's published more than 150 peer-reviewed scientific publications, is a TEDx speaker, and has won numerous Best Paper and Best Demo awards. So Gianluca will be bringing a computer science perspective to the panel today. So we'll start by posing a set of questions to the panel. We'll have some conversation and discussion, and then we'll open it up for questions from the floor and online. So to start us off with, a prominent challenge of our age, highlighted recently by Musk's takeover of Twitter, is preventing misinformation online while also preserving freedom of speech. In your view, what is important to overcome and navigate this challenge? And perhaps if I can ask Peter if you could kick us off.
Thanks very much. Look, it's great to be here and fantastic to be on this panel and sharing the stage with such an eminent group of colleagues. I'm feeling a little bit humbled, to be honest with you. When we talk about misinformation, there's always been a whole host of solutions which governments have come up with. Things like promoting news literacy, promoting good journalism, developing AI solutions to try and mitigate against the influence of fake news and misinformation, the ways in which we need to develop news literacy amongst our children, our young people, the way that we all have a responsibility to have a very varied diet. All of these things I think are really important and valuable. But I might be stepping on Gianluca's toes here, but I still think that it's missing the fundamental point that the social media network is forming a form of infrastructure for communications in our society. And in the same way that we got very upset, or the government got very upset about the Chinese company taking over sorry, I've had a mental block for a moment, taking over our getting involved in the 4G network. The government said that we couldn't have a foreign power owning and controlling such a critical piece of our infrastructure, and yet we allow that with the software, the social media companies that control and manage the algorithms that determine what we see and read on our social media feeds and the way in which we communicate. And so I think that we really need to start a fundamental conversation about regarding that software as essential public infrastructure in a way that is optimized not to harvest our attention for the profit of those particular companies, but that is optimized for good communication amongst ourselves. And I think, and there is a guy called Ethan Zuckerman who rather infamously invented the pop-up ad, and so perhaps in this is he's atoning for his sins when he says that we actually need to seize control of the algorithms from the social media companies, to make those algorithms transparent and to give us the power to tailor the algorithms in a way that suits us, but also compels them to engineer those algorithms to prioritize quality information, quality discourse over simply harvesting our attention.
Thanks very much, Peter.
Can I add on that? Thanks. Thanks, Peter. I totally agree with you. I think from a technology point of view, we do have the instruments to automatically detect misinformation online. The real challenge is how we use them, like you said. So we could possibly use this AI to detect misinformation and remove it from social media based on some signals. For example, the AI could identify some patterns, like if the claim comes from this politician, it may be fake news. So we remove it from the platform. What could possibly go wrong there? No, I don't think that's the way to use it, right? So in my opinion, and I agree with Peter, the way forward is, rather than censorship and removing content from platform, is to increase the transparency. But really by building data-driven products that empower users on social media to make that decision by themselves. So rather than having an algorithm deciding this is fake news, you user trust the algorithm, don't worry, it's all good, which is not really gonna happen. We better give the information to the users to decide by themselves. And what I mean is really telling them who is making a claim, why they could possibly make a claim, is there any conflict of interest, what's their reason why they are saying something, what's the benefit they could get if they say something, what ownership they have in the different entities mentioned in the claim. This is all information which may be available, but it is not necessarily put in context and surfaced to the users. So if we could have something like that, I think that's something users of social media could trust. And I'm not saying that something like this could be uniquely built by technology, but it's probably a mix with, this is what journalists are doing, right? They are using forensic methods to find out what's going on and tell the people. The challenge is that if we need to scale this up to whatever is going on social media and what everyone is tweeting, then it becomes difficult to scale. So really, we need the technology not to serve as a filter, the technology to decide what we see and what we don't, but rather to work with us, with the experts and with the users to then empower people to decide what we should trust and we should not. I think that's...
But make no mistake, this is a very radical idea, you know, and you can imagine a hashtag, a Twitter hashtag saying, make Twitter public, trending on Twitter. It's not going to happen. You know, make the algorithms public, that sort of thing. We've got to kind of work through a system to argue against it.
It's the people here, right? It's a question, it's a legal question, it's a policy question, it's a technology question. I don't think having the technology is enough. I don't think having the legislation is enough. I don't think one solution will solve it. So I think we need to find a solution that involves everything.
And the difficulty with many of these things is incentivizing the platforms, obviously, to take the steps that are required, while also balancing the fact that in any incentive program that you have to try and improve the quality of the information online, that then, of course, begs the question, how do you determine what is the quality information, and how do you determine whether it's fake news, as we use that term, or not? And I think the greatest difficulty, one we all seem to be in agreement, is that you quickly reach a point where you're asking the platforms really to be arbiters of what is misinformation. And that then, of course, raises the ugly head of potential censorship. Certainly many of the platforms have commented in some of the digital platform inquiries, and certainly in relation to the new raft of defamation reforms, that you quickly get to a point where the platforms will respond with a sort of remove content, ask questions later position. And I don't think any of us really want that to be the outcome of this.
I mean, sorry, I was going to say censorship happens because the ranking is a form of censorship. You know, we can't see everything all the time. You know, it's a simple fact. You know, algorithms rank information, and in doing so, they make judgments, and those judgments are value judgments. And the problem is that we don't know what those values are because the algorithms are utterly opaque to us. And so I think what everyone here is arguing for is transparency and control over the systems that decide how information is filtered and ranked to us. That doesn't solve the problem of information disorder, which is really what we're having to deal with here. But it does change the nature, I think, of the social media networks in a way that works for us rather than for the tech companies.
And that's, I mean, it's a real challenge, isn't it? Because we've got here social media companies that are incredibly powerful, incredibly well-resourced in every way. They've got a business model which, you know, arguably is about just monetizing eyeballs. So what they really want is eyeballs to be on their platform for as long as possible, if I've got that right. And that could be something we might pick up, is that how you're understanding their business model? And then we've got the challenges. Well, what would incentivize them to move away from that, given it seems to be serving them and their profits pretty well? And, you know, there is some benefits certainly that have been coming out of social media and the empowerment of many people to be able to have their voice heard, and from a freedom of speech perspective, but we're also seeing these really deep, significant challenges around misinformation, disinformation as well. Any other reflections, I guess, around that business model, how you're seeing it, and any solutions of what might possibly ever shift that?
I agree the business model is the cause of the problem in a way. It's more subtle than that, I believe, because what the platforms are trying to do is not just maximize the time users spend on the platform, but really having them engage in specific ways with the platform. For example, they see a certain value in a user who's sharing news and external content on the platform, but they see much more value from users who share personal stories on social media. And then among them, they distinguish between those who share positive stories, which are valuable, those who share negative stories, like family losses, those are the most valuable to them. They are extremely trustworthy, they trust the platform a lot, and those are the users who will stay for the long term. So this is how they model users, and then algorithms are optimized to make all users become like those most valuable users. And this is just because of the business model, because those users will not only spend more time on the platform, but they will be able, the platform will be able to monetize this time by showing them advertisement, and they will click advertisement, they will buy product, and that's how money comes in the platform. So the challenge here is that the algorithms are trained and to optimize for all users to become extremely trusting the platform, and then this happens, right? And then it happens that my mother-in-law, after her booster shot, she was sick for a week, versus this scientific study showed the side effects are minor. So the personal story is much more powerful, it's highlighted by algorithms, and then it creates all this echo chamber effect and propagation effect of misinformation. So the way to fix it, I guess, is to think of different business models, possibly.
You talk about incentives, and that implies that you can actually build in incentives. But I think the business model, you know, I mean, let's face it, I like the term surveillance capitalism. You know, the companies surveil us through the apps that we use and then sell that surveillance information to markets. And I don't think, and it's been an incredibly profitable enterprise. Incentives implies that you come up with something that is more profitable or works better. And I still think that the fundamental premise of allowing social media companies that are based, that are headquartered offshore, well away from our jurisdictions, we're ever going to be able to offer incentives. And I'm afraid I'm a little bit more radical than you are, or the question implies, where I think that we actually have to grasp a really difficult nettle and say that it is working counter to our democracy to have systems that encourage information disorder or support information disorder, support the kind of discourse that Gianluca was describing, in a way that undermines the integrity, the value, the quality of our public conversations and public debates. And I think the only way you're going to do that is by actively and quite aggressively taking back control. Now, that doesn't mean that you therefore hand control to governments. There are models, I think, that allow us to shape the way that we integrate and work with and relate to social media platforms in a way that doesn't immediately hand control to governments. But it's a conversation that we have to have, and I don't think we're getting there.
So if we do conceptualise these as, you know, real societal public infrastructures that are impactful, and then we need to perhaps rethink the whole sort of model underlying it, and perhaps the regulation of them is part of that as well.
That's my own view, yeah. And as I said, it's a radical, uncomfortable, awkward, and you know, really unpopular idea, I know, I accept that. But that's where I'm at, that's where I've landed.
Yeah, okay, thank you. How would you advise organisations respond to misinformation or disinformation about their operations, products and services? And how can they do this in a way that protects their reputation and trust? And perhaps I'll hand to you, if that's okay, Donna, to kick us off on this one.
Yeah, sure. I was saying to the panel earlier that a situation, I've been dealing with this sort of situation this week. One of our clients is a major retailer, and they had somebody enter their store with a pram and steal products last week. And then the staff member came and addressed that particular person and said, I know there's not a baby in your pram and I know you're stealing products. This conversation took part in a car park, and this was then filmed and it aired on every national TV station. We saw it straight away through our media monitoring and social listening tools that we work on with this client, and we called them straight away and said, we've got a plan, which I'll talk to you through in a second. This is what I think we should do. It's a publicly listed company, and they said we won't be addressing it right now. Over the weekend, there were 650 media clippings about this incident, and in the last 2 days, there's been 300. And there's been this huge conversation, and something that I wanted to sort of tap on a little bit from the last question is that News Corp put this story on their Facebook page, and then they've become a house for this huge conversation around the woman and the staff member. So whilst they're not, and a lot of the information that people are sharing and commenting on is misinformation, but at what point, whose role and responsibility is it to house that place of misinformation about the people involved in this situation? Our client has now responded, and what we've actually advise them to do is firstly gather all of the relevant information, and we wish that this had happened as quickly as possible. Once you have all the information, we don't advise that people respond to media questions, because it's kind of like putting wood on the fire, because the questions will just keep coming. We recommend that people issue a statement, and if the situation itself evolves, that you continuously update the key journalists that were interested in the situation as that happens, because that will show transparency and it will show that you really want to work with them to resolve the situation. In this instance, we've also recommended that the chair of the board or the CEO does a video news release stating the statement, and this is issued out quickly to everybody. And all key stakeholders, I think we're all aware, sometimes people will let the media know, but they haven't told their front of house staff in their retail stores in suburban, regional Queensland, for example. So then they might have customers coming in, quoting misinformation and talking to them about something they know nothing about. So we're also really quick to send out that statement to everybody as quickly as possible. We often don't recommend that you engage in media conversation unless there is a huge mistruth that you need to overcome. But if that is the case and the chairman or the CEO wants to face the media training is absolutely essential. And the one thing that we recommend that people do is practice the questions they don't want to be asked, more so than the questions they do. So we'd recommend acting quick, gathering relevant information and addressing the situation, and then moving on. If you continuously engage in dialogue on something that you've set straight, it's just going to continue the snowball effect of information if there's no more news to update. So stay tuned for what happens with that retailer. Hopefully our statement that's gone out today will put everything to bed. But one of my team members is actually meeting with News Corp today around the Facebook post, because whilst we've addressed the story and proven and talked about the stuff that's happened, it's the content and conversation that's happening online that has taken off like wildfire as well. So there's been a call to boycott the stores by mothers who don't feel safe walking into a store with a pram, and things like that have now happened. So yeah, interesting day.
Sounds like very, very sage advice, and perhaps advice which they might now, think they should have acted a little bit more, proactively, right at the very beginning of it. And sometimes I think there is a real diminishing of, oh, surely this couldn't, because you feel so perhaps right in the situation. I mean, this person was stealing, do you know what I mean? So, I think from an organisational lens where we're already somewhat biased to think of what we're doing as the right thing, I think it can be easy to underestimate and then be quite surprised by how the broader community might be responding to this. I was going to say, Sarah, was there anything else you'd like to add to that?
Well, obviously it depends on the particular circumstances as to what your legal options are. When it's goods or services under attack, there's the classic tort of injurious falsehood, and that does provide some avenue. It also provides you an avenue of going very quickly. You can sometimes get an injunction if your goods or services are under attack, but that's a different question to the to the example that Donna was giving, where it was more about the general reputation of the company in terms of their engagement with their customers. So unfortunately, it does depend on the particular circumstances that you have, but there are many avenues, and there's some overlap, obviously, between the measures that you take through someone like Donna and the measures that you might take through coming to see someone like me.
Yeah, okay. And I guess just in terms of that then, we might think about, this whole idea that we're seeing more and more people getting cancelled online, and even the fact that this is a term that we all sort of understand instantly what it means to be cancelled online, and this is increasingly happening. And I'm really curious to understand, defamation law. Often people say, well, people can't do that, there's defamation law. So Sarah, could you tell us, to what extent is something like defamation law or perhaps other regulations, to what extent can they be effective mechanisms to counter misinformation? And I guess I see it really sitting at that intersection of misinformation and freedom of speech as well.
So again, it depends on the context, and obviously I'm sounding very lawyerly in saying I have to caveat the whole thing. But defamation, of course, can be very helpful when your own personal reputation is under attack. And there are mechanisms, although at one extreme, injunctions are very hard to get. There have been examples of where there have been particularly vile and repetitive comments made on Twitter or Facebook or something like that, and the courts have shown a willingness to engage in providing the remedy of an injunction, an interim injunction at that point, where you can point to the fact that it's particularly vile. But generally speaking, injunctions are sort of not granted because the courts are very much in favour of freedom of speech in the defamation context. But in terms of generally pursuing a defamation cause of action to protect where you have been the victim of comments, and whether untrue or whether taken out of context, there's certainly many mechanisms. And initially, it doesn't necessarily lead to a full-blown defamation trial. Majority of cases, in my experience, don't go to trial. And the initial steps that you take in terms of identifying what has been said about you and contacting the person who said it against you, or contacting, whether it's, if it's in the case of the media, contacting them and saying, this has appeared on your Facebook feed. There are early intervention measures that you can take to protect your reputation. The difficulty, though, of course, and you would have to be living under a rock not to be familiar with some of the more high-profile defamation cases that have gone on and are currently going on, is that when you embark on a defamation lawsuit, you run a great risk of just engaging in character assassination. And because you just open that can of worms, and suddenly what was a very contained allegation made against you or a statement made against you, suddenly in defending that, if the defendant decides to take it on, they're going to unravel a whole lot of other aspects which you might not have wanted aired. So it's not for the faint-hearted.
It does make you wonder, even if you win the defamation, trial, whether you've actually really won in the sense of the damage to your reputation, regardless of the outcome. Yeah.
It's a really vexed question, but. And Peter can probably talk to this, the proliferation of defamation actions in Australia in particular demonstrates that people are willing to take it on.
I think defamation, and again, you might have your own views on this, Sarah, but defamation is one of those things where nobody wins. It's such a mess at the moment in Australia, and it's been very dysfunctional for quite some years. Defamation payouts in Australia have been astronomically high, eye-wateringly high. Rebel Wilson was awarded something like 4.3 million, I think, in damages. She had to return most of that, but nonetheless, that initial judgment was made. Geoffrey Rush got 2.9 or 2.3 million, I think. It was eye-watering. Again, eye-watering amount of money, and so often those people who happen to be in the public eye, who happen to be generally quite well off, have a lot of resources, can use defamation as a way of shutting down what in a lot of cases would be legitimate journalistic investigation. We can, the Christian Porter case is another recent high-profile case where defamation where he brought a defamation suit in a case which it's hard to argue had a very clear public interest. Now, there's been some reforms, and we can talk about how those reforms are shaping up at the moment. But defamation as it stands is a situation when no one really wins. The Dylan, and just in terms of freedom of speech, I think that the Dylan Voller case is another really interesting one, where Dylan Voller, for those of you who might not remember, was a young man who was held at the Dondale Detention Centre in the Northern Territory, and his treatment was exposed on a Four Corners program. Now, a number of news organisations published some stories about Dylan, and they posted those stories on Facebook. And the court, Dylan, there were a lot of very, very racist, abusive comments that members of the public posted in the comments section beneath the stories in a way that was unmoderated, and the news organisations were held to be responsible for those comments.
Well, they were held to be responsible for the publication of those comments.
Sorry, yes. Yes. Subtle lawyerly difference, but it's an important one. And so as a result, what's happened is that a number of news organisations have either shut off their comments section, or in the case of CNN, have simply removed their Facebook posts from Facebook pages from being seen in Australia.
And that is a real risk. And circling back, so almost to that first question, is that you then, if platforms feel that they are at risk of defamation suits, then of course they're going to remove those forums and be much more heavy-handed in terms of their control, which arguably reduces public discussion about really vital points and topics that should be discussed in an open and public forum. So there is that tension. The Voller case is still to be, the full implications of the Voller case are still to be determined, because the defences weren't run. It was just on the question of publication. Yes, I'm being very lawyerly, I'm afraid. And for defamation, I think many defamation lawyers probably take the Voller case as very much orthodox defamation law, but it's the ramifications of that for platforms where if they feel that, or well, certainly for media organisations, if they feel that it's too much of a commercial risk to provide a platform for people to engage in public discussion, then that of course raises the question, are we then, as a society, the poorer for that, if that is a position that they take? Peter would argue yes.
Yeah, I do. I mean, yes. I think that there has to be a thumb on the scale in favour of public debate, public discourse, public discussion.
And there are in the provisions, certainly in the last draft of reforms of the Defamation Act, there are now provisions to protect public interest journalism. There's always been innocent dissemination defence. The second raft of reforms will focus on what happens in terms of internet intermediaries, which covers the vast range from both internet service providers all the way through to the platforms, in terms of what is their liability, how should it be regulated, how should they be affected by, or to what extent should they be held liable for comments that are put on by a third party, where they are the ones administering or providing the platform. These are all really difficult questions, and many very clever people are considering them at the moment, and we're all waiting with bated breath to see what happens.
And it also comes back to the question of anonymity as well, which is really where a lot of, and this is what underlies a lot of the issues around comments.
But that is also a vexed question, in that anonymity in some ways helps people, because if you are a very controversial figure and you have a position that you want to take in a public discussion, in some ways being anonymous can help the message to get through, because then you're not being judged by the fact that you are that person, or if you're engaged, if you're say,
a trans person, and you want to engage in the current debate around gender reassignment surgery, but you don't want to expose your own identity because of the vitriol which we so often see online around those issues. Now, how do we allow someone like that to, in that kind of position, to make public comments, maintaining their anonymity, but at the same time making them and everybody else who's using anonymity accountable for defamatory comments or abusive comments? it's a really difficult, complex argument. And again, this is why I think that we need to rethink, reimagine the way in which the network itself actually operates, rather than trying to put on patches that might somehow help the system as it exists to work better.
I think what we're really hearing is we need a multi-pronged kind of approach, because there's inherent paradoxes and tensions around all of this. You know, we've highlighted around the freedom of speech versus, you know, misinformation and the potential for that and that tension, but there's many other sort of tensions that you're picking up here as well. My final question before we open it up for questions from the audience then is just around when the truth is exposed, whether it's online, you know, there's been misinformation, then the truth is exposed in some way, whether it's through some sort of legal mechanism or defamation case, whatever. Does that actually get taken up by people? Like, do people actually then lean in and change their understanding and view of the situation? What's your experiences of that, perhaps across all panelists?
Okay, I can start. I think the short answer is no. People won't change their mind just because they are told that's the truth, right? It's a much more complex process. Myself and colleagues have studied how people interact with information and what makes them trust or not trust information online, and how you can present it in a way that it's trustworthy. I think the way to do it, it's that there is no really shortcut. It's a very long process. It's building trust between the platform and the users, so that they can really believe that the information are given, it's reliable. And in the end, it doesn't really matter whether it is reliable or not. It's really a question of building this perception and trust relationship with the users, so that they will trust the source of the information and where it's coming from. I think the trick is making sure the users understand that where the claim is coming for as the user's value in mind. It's not big pharma set this and all they care is about the money and not us, right? It's about caring about us, the people, the users. So if this information can be presented in a way in which it is clear that the benefit is for the users and they care about the users, then it's more likely they are going to trust. But it's a very long-term process. It's not just we show this way it works and we show it this way it doesn't work. It's really a long-term process in which we need to convince people of something.
We've been hired quite a few times to kind of flood truth, in a sense. A classic example is a beautiful regional or suburban cafe that has a terrible review on TripAdvisor, and then that gains momentum. We might be then engaged by the restaurant to say, how do we turn this around? We would run an incentive campaign to incentivise all diners to leave a review, good, bad or ugly, and then we'd encourage the restaurateurs to respond and start engaging with those reviews. We would also start sharing feedback online, doing campaigns to drive online chatter about the restaurant. That way when in a, 3, 6, 12 months time, again takes time, somebody goes on, the average isn't a 3-star but it's a 4.2. So there is ways in terms of marketing that we can help change that. We've also been engaged in the past where there's been a professional organisation that has had some negative press written about them, sometimes because it's true. And then they come up to us and say, we've actually learnt our lesson, we've changed our way, we have new processes in place. And so our approach isn't to deny or say that any of that bad behaviour didn't happen, but we just turn our focus on the good and just make sure that we kind of bury that information with as many positive news stories as possible. So when you Google that potential organisation, that those stories come up on page 4 on Google rather than on page 1, and none of us are going to page 4. So that's kind of another way that we can build trust back up, is sharing good news, acknowledging the bad, but just making sure that the conversation is a bit more positive in a sense than negative.
Anything else there, Peter, you wanted to add?
Oh, yeah, I mean, this stuff is really sticky. Bad information, or information itself tends to stick to your beliefs, or your beliefs tend to harvest. Let me rephrase that. If you have a preconceived belief, then anything that confirms that belief, that confirmation bias that we've all heard of, really tends to stick. And it doesn't, and simply inoculating or countering bad information with good information, as Gianluca said, just doesn't cut it. I mean, an example is the war in Ukraine. You show someone in the West, an American, an Australian, a photograph of dead Ukrainians, and that's evidence of Russian atrocities, Russian war crimes. You show a Russian that same photograph, and they'll say, well, that's evidence of Ukrainian false flag operations. That's the Nazis killing their own people to discredit us. Now, that photograph is that photograph. And saying that, having a caption that's from The Guardian or the New York Times or any other newspaper saying that these are dead Ukrainians who are killed by Russians isn't going to change a Russian's perspective on this. Simply putting good information or accurate information out there isn't enough. It takes a lot more of the kind of really deep psychological understanding of what's going on to really shift people. Now, at a smaller level, I think it's perfectly possible. At a micro level, it is possible to correct bad information, particularly when you're dealing with misperceptions around a business. But it's very different when you're talking about views that challenge people's worldview. If you're proud of your country, then if you're a nationalist, then anything that challenges that nationalism, that challenges your fundamental understanding of the way the world works, is very, very difficult. It's very resistant to that. If you are someone who believes in individual rights and responsibilities, if you believe that the government should have no role to play in an individual's life, then it's much easier for you to dismiss climate change and the climate change, the kind of collective response that we need to deal with climate change, because that challenges your really deep fundamental ways in which you see and understand the world. If you're, on the other hand, a very communitarian-focused person, you believe in collective action, you believe that governments can and should be more engaged, then it's much easier for you to accept that climate change is real and that we need to adopt fairly radical strategies. That's why these things are really, really complex. It's not just a question of accurate information and inaccurate information. And I don't really know that we've even begun to understand it. These things are hardwired into the way that we are as humans. It's just that social media, the digital world has elevated and expanded and weaponized, if you like, a lot of these problems.
Thank you, Peter. I think at this point we might open it up for questions, both online and from the floor here. Shannon, do we have any online? No? Okay, so it is free. We've had some incredibly insightful and I think but also provocative ideas here shared by the panel. Any questions? Gabby, yeah?
So taking my academic hat off and putting my mother hat on, I'm sure you've all seen The Social Network, which is about how these Facebook and Snapchat and Instagram enhance addiction to these platforms from our children. As a mother of a 16-year-old I've just given up on that one in terms of trying to get her off social media, but a mother of a 10-year-old who is yet to have an iPhone, and I told her she can have one when she's 16. Do you see any time during which this will be regulated in any way or legislated to protect our children?
It's a great question, and I think on the minds of many mothers and fathers in the room.
So there's obviously a move on to take some action in this space. There's I haven't got the full name of it, but the anti-trolling bill that's currently sitting at the federal level, and there have been some various moves to try and get the platforms to sign up to voluntary codes of conduct. And of course, as parents, we know that most of these platforms also have an age limit. I personally, I'm also speaking as a parent here, I find it very disappointing that this is a largely unregulated space, not just from a public discussion point of view, but also from a user point of view. And I think digital literacy is something that has very much been lacking in terms of our kids. So I'm not sure. There have been some moves in other jurisdictions to try and bring in some attempts at legislating to protect, to deal with cyberbullying and those types of issues, but I don't have the answer.
Gianluca, you must have.
You must have the answer.
Just wanted to add one thing on that. Platforms are trying to regulate the content which is allowed on their own platforms, and different platforms follow different approaches. Across most, not necessarily all platforms, illegal content is not allowed, where illegal could be like child pornography is not allowed, but it's not true everywhere. And then you have platforms where pornography is not allowed, which may not necessarily be legal, and other platforms do allow it. So following this pattern, we could have a platform which is designed for a specific age group, and the content on the platform is designed for specific age groups. We don't have this yet, but again, we could have something like that, where not just the content, but also the algorithms, the ranking, the push for engagement and addiction is reduced or adjusted based on the user base. We also don't really want our kids to be with the old guys together and having these weird conversations. So there is nothing like that yet. It's a very wild and dark environment, and some platforms are much worse places than other platforms. But we could possibly have a better environment. I don't think taking them out is going to happen, right? We tried and it's impossible. So we better build an online environment which is safer rather than making it the forbidden thing, which only makes it more attractive.
I think there's also the concerning aspect about the addictive nature of these technologies, and I think a lot of the research suggests that they are highly addictive, just as addictive as drugs. And so it does sort of sound counterintuitive then that we're handing off on children a device that we know is as addictive, you know, as drugs, and yet we're saying you should have the skills to be able to manage this yourself. So I mean, I think that's supporting around that, and whether it's limitations of times, but it is an eternal challenge. And even when we can educate and trust you know, children to be more discerning about what they're watching, and maybe they're not necessarily watching bad content, but just the sheer amount of the content and their own inability to necessarily self-regulate that, or having to learn that over time, can be quite, I think, disruptive.
But
yeah.
I think you're right. When you talk about addiction, I think that's the key word here. You know, that this is a chemical addiction because of the relationship of or the way in which engagement with social media posts often releases those little dopamine hits, you know. And it's like giving kids a bottle of rum and saying, kids, you know, in moderation, you know, just control how much of that moonshine that you're downing. And I'm sure, I mean, my partner has 15, 16-year-old kids, and again, trying to get them off social media at 2 o'clock in the morning can be an absolute nightmare. I think, and maybe the analogy is imperfect, and I do not want to be seen, God forbid anybody says that Peter Greste advocates government control, but to me the analogy is a little bit like the early days of the automobile. You know, they built cars that we all knew revolutionized the way that we did things, the way that societies interacted. But governments have eventually recognized that you have to have collapsible steering wheel, the steering columns, and you have to have braking systems that actually work, and emissions control systems and seat belts. And the car companies all moaned and complained and said this is going to increase our costs and no one's going to wear them and no one's going to buy these vehicles, until it became part of our understanding that you've got to have these safety systems in place for us to be able to use the technology safely. And I think that I think we're still in the early stages of the development of the automobile.
And I think that's a great note to end on, and one that really kind of unifies a lot of the day, because Genevieve Bell's also, you know, talked about exactly that of when cars were introduced as almost like as a way of understanding our level of maturity in being able to regulate and manage and, artificial intelligence and emerging technology. And it's not, it's the car, but it's also the driver's license. It's also the fact that you drive on the left, or the right, and that we have dividers and that we have this whole infrastructure that's built up. And I think in reality, we're at a very early stage of our development of both the organisational governance and sort of more societal level sort of infrastructure to be able to ensure that these technologies, social media, all the way through to very advanced emerging tech, is being used in a responsible, in a trustworthy way that is engendering stakeholder trust and, importantly, mitigating the risks and mitigating the harms. And I do think, unfortunately, our children are one of the generation that's probably going through where they're having to figure it out a bit more themselves. I was delighted when my 16-year-old watched a YouTube video that talked about these dopamine hits, and he's now on a dopamine detox. And he's done that himself. So there is hope out there. Okay, can I please ask you to please join me in thanking our panellists. I hope you would agree that was an incredibly stimulating, again, thought-provoking, really insightful session. Really appreciated your time in coming out. I'm looking out the window there at that very bleak weather out there, and I really do appreciate all of the efforts and time that you've contributed to this. What I'd like to do now is just really wrap up the day. I am conscious that we're coming up to the close of our summit today. So really what I wanted to start with is thanking not only our panel here, but all the panellists that have contributed today, all the speakers, both from TIGA and from industry, the people who have offered their industry, discussant wrap-ups and shared their insights with this, the moderators and the organisers of today. So can we please have a round of applause for everyone? And also I really wanted to thank you, the audience, both online as well as here in the room. One of the real key aims of TIGA is to share our research in a way that's accessible, in a way that is impactful. Really, we're very committed to evidence-based practice, and so we can't do that without these sort of co-creation of knowledge and understanding with you. So I really just appreciate, on behalf of TIGA, just wanted to thank you for your support, thank you for coming along, sharing your insights, your great questions that have really deepened the understanding that we can all take away from today. If you know others that may be interested in TIGA, please invite them to join our TIGA LinkedIn site. That will keep everyone up to speed with what we're doing. We will be having some breakfasts going forward, some nice breakfast events on particular topics, again bringing an interdisciplinary research and industry perspective to those. We also particularly have a seminar coming up as part of our seminar series in June, where we'll have Dr. Adam Kay speaking about his incredible research looking at mindfulness training in a range of different organisations and how this acts as a really positive intervention that has a significant impact on enhancing psychological safety and trust in the workplace. And I think, after the pandemic and a lot of the challenges that we're facing around the employee value proposition and wellbeing and burnout, particularly in our hospitals and aged care type context, it's really important research. We also have an executive education short course on trust, ethics and governance that is currently in the planning, and we're looking at launching that in around September, October. So again, please keep your eye out for that. And we'll also have some post-communication coming up, post-event communications, which will really just seek your ideas on what you took away from today and any suggestions you have for future events, but also future kind of activities that you'd like to see TIGA involved in. And if you'd like to be involved in any of those, we always welcome it. While we're based at the University of Queensland, we see our role very much as curating and bringing together expertise, both from research and from industry, government, not-for-profit sectors, all sectors, to come together to really solve these incredibly challenging trust, ethics and governance type of issues. I think one of the things that I'll really take away from today is just how complex a lot of these issues are. There are inherent tensions and paradoxes in them. There's no single easy solution. We will need multi-pronged solutions, and that will involve a set of different stakeholders at multiple different levels. We need the law and the regulation, we need the organisational leadership right from the top of those boards all the way down to the frontline workers. We need a multi-pronged approach to doing this. And finally, I'd just like to particularly thank Shannon Colville for all of her efforts in coordinating and bringing this event together. I don't even know if Shannon's still here. Yes, she is. Wonderful. So thank you, Shannon. Just really wanted to say thank you to you.
It was a team effort, so thank you.
It's always a team effort. So with that, we invite you, please, if anyone would like to stay, we'll be here for another good half an hour to an hour. So please continue the discussions. Please, if you'd like to speak with our panellists after we close, feel free to do so. And again, just, thank you for joining us. And finally, if there's any research sort of interests around anything we've talked about today, you can see we've got deep expertise both at the University of Queensland but also across our network. So we'd love to have a conversation with you about research that you think is important and research that you'd like to partner with us around. So just get in contact with Sarah, Shannon, myself or Rada, have a look at our website, and we'd love to pick up that conversation with you. Thanks, everyone.